Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us to discuss the Maximum Import Capability Enhancements issue paper. My name is Isabella Nicosia, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I'll be facilitating the web conference today. I'm also joined on the line by our two presenters, Catalin Mixa from Transmission Infrastructure Planning and Milos Bosnek from Infrastructure and Regulatory Policy. On the line also is Perry Servedio from Market Design Policy, Anthony Ivankovich and Jordan Pena from Legal, Delphine Ho from California Regulatory Affairs, Abdul Muhammad Ali from Operations Engineering Services, and Ibrahim Rahimi from Regional Transmission North. The presentation, along with the paper for today's call, is available on the Maximum Import Capability Enhancements Initiative webpage on the California ISO website. Today's call is being recorded. The recording is for informational and convenience purposes only, and any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. We will be taking questions throughout the call today, and you can enter the question queue at any time by pressing #2 on your telephone keypad. This slide here shows where we're at in the CAISO's Policy Initiative stakeholder process. This is our first meeting for this initiative, so we are here at the beginning of proposal development at the issue paper. And the agenda for today will start off with an introduction. We have a few references linked in the presentation as well. And then we'll go over the purpose of the stakeholder initiative and discuss the calculation, assignment, trading, and tracking of MIC through the RA process. And then we'll pause there for an open discussion and take any questions at that time. And then we will also discuss the wheel-through priorities and development of a process that would permit wheel-through transactions to reserve import capability and transmission across the ISO system. And then after that, we will also stop for open discussion and take questions at that time as well. And then finally, we will wrap up today with the initiative schedule and next steps. So with that, I will hand it over to Catalin Mixa, and we will get started with an introduction.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. As we promised last year during the stakeholder process regarding MIC, that we will come back and we'll try to discuss and address additional stakeholder suggestions and the concerns you might have had. So this is a process to do that. We also have a few new issues in here, but basically it is meant to addressing your concerns from last year. So I'll start with an introduction. As you all may remember, what maximum import capability, it's how the ISO determines the simultaneous deliverable imports to the aggregate of load. Just a reminder that we do test deliverability. This deliverability is the same as internal generation deliverability. We all test them in a single deliverability, base case, and we run all the contingencies, and we make sure that the internal generators that are counted for RA, as long with MIC, which is deliverability for imports on each one of the interties, are all deliverable to the aggregate of load. Unlike deliverability to the internal generators, which are actually owned by the generators themselves, deliverability on the intertie is given out to load-serving entities so they can transact any RA they would like on that intertie coming from outside. So the load-serving entities' RA import showings are limited on each intertie by their share of MIC on that intertie. A reminder that we are calculating this yearly, and we also allocate this out yearly. Here we have two references. So if you're new to this process, most of you already know these things by heart, but if you're new to the process, especially if you come over from somewhere else in the West and like to talk about wheel-through transactions, please familiarize yourself with the tariff section and the BPM, what actually MIC it is and how does it get allocated. Next slide, please. So here we are. We're basically going to discuss your concerns and suggestions that previously we heard, and you can make any new suggestions if you like, regarding the calculation, allocation, trading, and tracking of MIC. We will also be going through, the probably the second half of this discussion, about a new process that would permit will-through transactions to reserve import capability and transmission across the ISO system on a longer-term basis than just a day-ahead basis. Also, we will try to review the will-through priority access in the ISO system. Just a reminder for those of you joining today, this has nothing to do with the summer 2021 and really has nothing to do with summer 2022 as well. The RA process, the first year we can start making any changes would be RA year 2023. The reason we cannot make changes to 2022 is because the process to allocate RA imports for 2022 will start in June. In order to have a FERC decision by June, we need to file in probably April. In order to file in April, we need to have a board decision in March, which is next week, and there is no room for any stakeholder in between now and then. So basically, the first year this can be implemented is our year 2023, and we would need a FERC approval, a new tariff, and new BPM changes by June 1st, 2022 in order to get implemented by 2023. Okay, so if anybody has any general questions, I guess I could take them now before we go through the steps, the calculation, the allocation, and the rest of the stuff. Anybody would like to queue in for any general item issues?
So again, you can enter the question queue by pressing #2 on your telephone keypad. Ethan, will you let us know if anyone enters the queue?
Of course. I'll go ahead and give it a moment. So far, I don't see any hands in the queue at this time. It looks like we have one that just jumped in. Would you like me to unmute them now?
Sure, go ahead.
Caller, you are unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hey, Catalin and company, it's Tony Braun. Can you guys hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
Thanks.
Go ahead.
Hey, first of all, I want to say thank you. I think some of the POUs were the squeaky wheel here on trying to elevate the priority of this issue. So I'm going to definitely acknowledge that and say thank you for teeing this up. And we've had some developments since then that changed the character of this a little bit, but nevertheless, we greatly appreciate you guys prioritizing this. I'd like to ask the ISO to maybe keep an open mind with respect to timing because of some of the other issues that are now impacted and some of the criticality of that and the MEC issue that is important also for some of the load-serving entities. No position on it right now, but I would like to sort of keep an open mind on what's the art of the possible as far as timing. So that's a simple request, and we'll put it in our comments.
Sure. Thank you, Tony. I guess what refers to RA, it's probably the first year we can implement is 2023. But if there are any new things that can be implemented, like for the wheel-throughs and such, we'll try to figure out if those can be implemented earlier.
Thank you, sir.
We'll take it on an advisement. I don't see getting a FERC approval before this June 1st.
Yeah, that's correct. And I understand the recognition of the RA year and the regulatory process. I just think it probably requires some additional stakeholder thought, and maybe we'll figure out some creative ideas. That's all I had. Thank you.
Are there any other? Thanks. Are there any other questions?
We do have one other question in the queue. I'll go ahead and put them through now. Caller, you're unmuted. Please go ahead.
This is Partha Malvadkar with PG&E. Tony and the ISO really addressed my question. I was just going to basically try to understand a little more of the details on sort of what could be carved out to move forward quicker with regard to the wheel-through priorities. Well, I recognize that there's inconsistencies in the process now between the RA process and the wheel-through priority process, and there might be areas that we could address sort of in the interim. So I'm glad to hear that will be thinking about that sort of for not just for 2023, but for 2022 as well. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. And if you're interested in that, there are some interim issues that are getting done for 2021 and 2022. We can discuss in the second part of the stakeholder call, but those are part of the 2021 initiatives. So I think there are interim things that are getting done for 2021 and 2022. This is more geared towards a long-term vision, how things should work in the long term rather than in the immediate. And there are things that are getting done for the immediate. We can discuss some more once we get there.
Is there any other questions?
There are no further questions in the queue at this time.
Okay.
Thank you. So, well, let's go through first how MIC calculation is done today. Most of you I know already. So we're actually using mostly a historical-based approach where we are getting the total, but also each intertie gets allocated based on its uses. So basically, what we're taking the 2 hours in each of the 2 highest years with highest imports among the last 5. And when the loads are above 90%, and we're doing an average of those, and that's basically your MIG. Now, the MIG does get tested forward, so we test each one of the interties. Basically, what we do is we look at remaining import capability for each intertie. So those of you that might be familiar with what remaining import capability it is anything that's not locked. So if today some of the MIG is actually locked with ETCs, TOR, and old contracts, pre-2006 contracts, and what the process assures is that on a going forward basis, whatever is not logged has enough room to meet all the state and federal policy goals. So we go through that, we go intertie by intertie, and we assure there is enough room to meet state and federal policy goals. If it is not sufficient, then we do expand MIG, and sometimes we propose new transmission in order to expand MIG, but we do expand MIG in order to make sure that the portfolios from state and federal are all met. So that's how the calculation is done today. Next slide. Last year, we had the discussion about it, and I think we have, while the ISO is not willing to get rid of the process, and we thought about it. We had discussions last year if we can get rid of it or not. And the ISO did make a decision we will not get rid of the allocation process because really only about 1/3 of the total overall tie capacity, which is if you just look at a single tie by single tie by single tie, to add all of them up, that is about 44,400. But if you only look at the deliverable imports, which are the simultaneous deliverable imports, that number is way smaller. It's only about 1/3 of that. So that's the reason why we don't believe we can get rid of it. But we are willing to change the methodology somehow. And so what suggestions we had last year was that why don't we look at some liquidity at certain branch groups and maybe considering, magnitude of RA showings. Let's be honest, the RA showings cannot be above the whatever was already given out, but some interties have much higher IRA showings than some other ones. And we, got requests in the past from low-stream entities saying, well, yes, you're giving us import capability on one intertie, but there is no liquidity there. Nobody wants to sell there. They all wants to sell on a different intertie. Yet we somehow still see schedules coming from those interties. So it's a little bit, disconcerting that we can actually see the energy flowing on some intertie, but there is no capacity to be purchased behind those. So, we are willing to see if there is a methodology that maybe can account for something like that. The challenges to overcome here is that, basically the MIG is limited, and probably if we increase the branch group, another one will have to go down. There's only so much deliverability that we have coming from a certain direction in the system. Another problem that we have is most of the interties are already, fully utilized. And what I'm trying to say about that is that even though there might be something available this year, we already have a lot of generation in the queue coming from about the same general part of the system that basically, along with the imports, have already taken the entire deliverability that's coming from an area. We haven't, sit down to go tie by tie, but I'm fairly confident in everything coming right now from Palo Verde area or Meade area or Coy area. Those are already fully utilized, and there is very little, if anything, left on any one of those intertypes, and those are probably the ones with the most liquidity. So we have some challenges to overcome, but we're willing to listen. If anybody has a specific methodology, how to, maybe do a better job rather than just historically looking at those numbers, how to better align for what liquidity might be there or what our showings might be on certain intertypes. Next slide, please. We've also heard last year regarding deliverability studies that, some stakeholders suggesting, well, let's just not do MEEC at all. Don't allocate deliverability to anybody. Let us go buy whatever we want to and then test it for us. I guess we could do that, but that we have some serious challenges there. If we go do that and we test it at the end, there could be, some LSEs be left with stranded assets, and I don't know what we're going to do about that. We can't allow people to go buy outside and they go buy 20,000 megawatts. There is no way we're going to bring that over. So which 5,000 megawatts is going to get cut? Which LSE's share is going to get cut in one branch group? So it's going to be fairly significant impact to the CPM backstop cost allocation. If some of these contracts are kicked out after the showings are in and they cannot count for RA, then the LSE is stuck with the contract and then is given a CPM backstop cost as well. This could be very costly for load serving entities. It also requires a lot more time. So basically, deliverability studies take usually over a month. You have to model everything in. That takes a while. Then you have to run the studies. They have to interpret the studies, and you have to validate that. So it takes usually over a month to run these studies. We definitely cannot do that in the month ahead time frame. Can be done in the year ahead time frame. I guess it might be workable in the year ahead time frame if we set the month of November, maybe early December for this process out. But then the CPM backstop could, fall into January and inside the year unless we change all the target dates when the showings are coming in. So this is a very complicated issue with not doing deliverability tests ahead of time, but waiting after the showings are in. So I'll stop here for this couple of issues regarding the calculation and the studies. So if anybody has anything new to add to that, or maybe somebody has talked through how they would have maybe liked to change how the calculation is done to account for liquidity or RA showings or any of that stuff, I guess you guys can jump in and maybe give people more details. I'll open it up to anybody who has any questions about the calculations or new insights on that.
As a reminder, you can enter the question queue by pressing #2 on your telephone keypad.
We do have some questions in the queue already. I'll go ahead and put the first caller through. Caller, you are unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Doug Boccignone from Flynn Resource Consultants for CalCCA. You described the MIC process where you're looking at the maximum imports that overlap with the peak load hours. In light of the RA enhancements proposal to do a sort of a portfolio assessment to look also at the evening peak or net load peak hours, are you considering, potential changes to the MIC process to account for that? I'm thinking about, when I've looked at it, at least during certain times of the year, the imports during the evening hours are often, double during the gross load peak hours. And if parties are going to have an RA requirement to cover the net load peak, but you can only get MIC based on the gross load peak, it's going to create a problem.
Yeah, so I can tell you from experience, it's not really a problem. Let me try to explain why. So Isabella, get me back 2 slides, please. So basically, we are taking the absolute highest imports when the load is above 90%, and in the last almost 3 years now, all those hours are almost exclusively 8 p.m. hours. So it's already, so the maximum import already accounts for that kind of 8 p.m. hour already. So that is when we see the highest import. That's what's establishing MIC already. And we allow the same import all across the year. But the idea is that the MIC is already established and it already counts for that super high import because we are taking the absolute highest import we've ever seen when the load is above 90%. I don't think because of this we need to change.
Okay, you're saying because it's 90%, it ends up being the hours that I'm talking about.
Yes, usually the hours you're talking about are about around 97 to 98% of the load.
Okay. Yeah, because what I'm concerned about is, those are hours when you're sort of backing down the internal generation and then you're, importing more energy that's displacing the gas-fired resources. But so I just wanted to make sure we could account for that so that we could still get access to the resources we need. Get credit and have a motivation to procure those.
That's correct. It's already accounted for. I can publish some of those hours, but they're about the last 3 years, almost exclusively only hours, late hours, 1900, 2800, 2100.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate that.
Alrighty. Should we move on to the next caller?
Yes, go ahead.
All right. Caller, you are now unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Wei Zhou from SCE. Hey, Kathleen, I just have a quick clarified question because I try to understand. Well, thank you for putting the question, but I want to make sure I understand the existing process right. So I think once you get like a historical, amount of imports, how do you allocate that amount to the individual branch groups? Was it based on the actual flow on the branch groups as well, or just based on a limit on that branch group? Can you talk a little bit more on that process?
Yes. So the calculation that we're talking about here, this method. So the way the work actually gets done is we're finding out what are those hours and what are those days when we have the absolute highest imports, and then we look and we say okay, the 8 p.m. was the hour with the absolute highest import. Then what we do is we go and pull from Oasis, we pull the schedules. So the calculations are done based on the schedules for that hour ending, whatever it is. And we go pull the schedules from Oasis, and then we look at what was the actual schedules on each intertie. So each intertie, so we do this 4 times for each one of those hours, and then we have that average, and that average dictates not just the total MIC, but that average actually dictates what each intertie gets.
Oh, okay. So in my mind, it's more of a bottom approach. You kind of, it's not trying to set a total amount, but you look at total amount just to select the hours and the days. But once the days and hours are selected, then you go intertie by intertie. Is that right? So the calculation would look at actual interties.
Yes, we take the schedules from Oasis for those days and those hours, and then we we have scheduled for each one of the interties, and then we do the the calculation, the average between those 4 hours, and that's what it gives each intertie their own number and their own allocation. That's how much each intertie is allocated to of the total MIC. Of course, once you do the total, you can figure out what the total is as well.
Yeah, that's very helpful. But what I think you also said, if you're going to adjust the MIC on one intertie up, then others have to go down. So I'm not quite understanding. If you do the bottom-up approach, why it would matter if you're adjusting, the MIC on one batch group, why it doesn't matter to the rest of the batch groups? Because you're not looking at the total amount. Am I right?
Yeah, we are looking at the total amount. So let me try to explain that part. Once we know what the whole thing is, we go and we model it intertie by intertie, and then I have to test deliverability. And there is only so much deliverability for simultaneous available. I can't go back and say, okay, well, let's get Palo Verde up by another 1,000 megawatts. All of a sudden, that's going to fail the test. So I have to back off some other interties in order to achieve the same simultaneous number, close to the same simultaneous number. So it's usually it's kind of a net zero gain. There might be very small gains you can make here and there, but in order for some interties to move up, some other ones will have to move down because there is only so much deliverability available coming from one general area.
So is that simultaneous limit being calculated, or just being limited by the modeling? So is that kind of an input to the modeling, or is the actual model cannot facilitate certain amount of imports?
We are testing it. We are actually plugging it in the base cases and testing it. I guess we can plug in the higher number and test it first, and then if it fails, but I can about guarantee you that it will fail, especially from some significant increases. If you're talking about 10 megawatts and 20 megawatts and whatnot, and it's likely it might pass, but we're talking about hundreds and thousands of megawatts on certain branch groups, I guarantee you the process will fail, and then we'll have to adjust something else down if we're adjusting something up.
Okay. But my last question is, when you look at the liquidity, is that observation that liquidity could be very different than the historical usage of interties? Is that, I guess, probably because of time lagging issue?
Yeah, the question I had is I forgot exactly whom proposed this, but it was either probably Edison or PG&E. I forgot who it was, but there was a proposal on the table that we look at liquidity from certain hubs, and I don't really know how to quantify that. What is the liquidity of one hub versus the other? Where do I get the data? What's the publicly available data that I can figure it out which one of these interties or hubs is more liquid than another? If we're not using liquidity, but we are using RA showings, I know how to do that. We already know what the RA showings is. We just need to publish them and figure out what interties are more used than the other ones. So I have data for that. But if people are trying to, somehow come up with a method to improve this calculation by using liquidity, I personally need to understand what do they mean by that, and where do I get a public data that translates to liquidity.
Thank you, Catherine. Yeah, we'll think about it. I think to me, the idea is, trying to look at from commercial transaction perspective as well to see, what contracts you got, and then try to facilitate those contracts. I think that's the idea, but we'll think more about that. So.
Thank you, Ed. Do we have any more questions?
We do have 2 more questions in the queue. I'll go ahead and put the next caller in. Caller, you are now unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, Catalin. This is Ellen Wolf from Mazzaro Consulting. Thanks for the presentation and for the opportunity to discuss some of these things. As you were talking, especially at the end before you broke for questions, about the limited availability of MIC, especially in light of other resources that are wanting to interconnect within the CAISO. I had this deja vu back to when this process was first implemented, and I remember asking Mark Rossbader, well, how do we know there's going to be enough MIC? And he said, well, it looks like there's enough MIC now for all the demand, and if we ever need more, we'll just do what we need to do to create more. And it strikes me that we don't really have a mechanism like in generation interconnection for expanding the capability of the grid to have more MIC. We don't have an assignment policy, not that necessarily we want direct assignment, but I wondered if you could comment a little bit on whether that's a possibility to, sorry.
Alan, yeah, thanks for the question. We do today, so we do, but it's a little bit harder, I guess. We don't have an easier way of doing it, but we do have it today. So we have, two major different ways to do that. Okay, we rarely have a reliability problem where, for certain contingency you have certain overloads because you can always kind of curtail the imports, especially when we had enough resources. Now we are a little bit in a pinch on that today, but beyond that, what we do have is we do have the state and federal policy goals. So we want to make sure that if these portfolios that are coming over, they are deliverable, and then we want to make sure that we have enough deliverability. Now, until today, we only had problems coming from the IID area, and we did some upgrades west of Devers and some other places in order to increase MIC from that area. And I think starting next year, actually, we'll have a higher number coming from that area once west of Devers is in service. So that's one. The other one is economic analysis. So we are seeing differential in prices from outside to inside, and that translates into energy prices and also in capacity prices. So we are accounting for that in our economic analysis. So there were some projects that were justified based on economics that were coming over the intertie. I agree with you. We didn't have too many, but we did have a few. So we have a few ways. It's not a specific way tied like you have deliverability for generators. There is no way to have a request coming from outside. I want to increase deliverability from Palo Verde, therefore let's build a line for it. It will have to go through, at least the way it is designed today, we'll have to go through an economic analysis on cost differential of capacity plus energy differential in running some production cost simulation, and that will be your justification for increasing that. There is no such thing as a request from like a generator owner or something like that. I agree with you.
Well, that's a great answer, because the slide that you talked through at the end made it sound like it's just a hard stop when you run out of the MIC. So it's really good to hear that you're thinking of it. It seems like the economic analysis in TPP is not sufficient to make sure there's enough deliverability. So I'm not sure how then you'll close that gap, especially as resource adequacy really becomes the thing that seems like it's got a shortfall right now. But I guess the question is how do we develop specific mechanisms for making sure that the MIC can grow as it's cost effective for it to grow?
Yeah, well,
is that within the? Go ahead.
It's Jeff here. So, but Catalin identified the two studies that we do in the policy and the economic. In the policy, based upon the portfolios from the CPUC of where looking to procure if it's outside, that's where we do the deliverability studies in the TPP as well for the policy studies.
Okay, so it sounds like in your minds it will naturally expand if the portfolios and the resource mix that seems prudent sort of demands it to. There are ways that it will naturally expand.
Yeah, there's the opportunity for it. That's through the policy analysis in the TPP.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
All All right, moving on to our last caller. You are now unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Bonnie Blair for the Six Cities group. So I have a question about the sort of the description of the determination of import deliverability as kind of a zero-sum calculation. Does that, it sounds to me like that assumes some total level of imports based on the historical flows and some total output from internal generators, that's not going to change, and also that the load is not going to change. Am I right about that?
Yeah, this is Catalin. So basically, what we're trying to say is that the load is just changing with the CEC load forecast. It's not too much of a change every year, right? It goes up or down by 1% or something like that. It's not a tremendous amount of change in load. There's some relatively small change in load. So putting that on the side is we do have the transmission, and the imports are fighting to get in along with all the generators that are connected around the same area inside the ISO. That pool of generator connecting inside the ISO, it's growing and growing and growing, and it's becoming, and it's queued, and for FERC orders, we have to protect their queue priority and everything. So we really can't go and extend MIC to very high levels, if that will be in the detriment of everybody. So in the queue, and they were promised to be fully deliverable, and now they're not going to be fully deliverable. So we really can't do that. If we believe that we need to expand a certain intertype, we need to queue some of these expansions on the intertype along with the generators and propose some transmission upgrades through the methods we just described in the last few minutes. But it is possible to increase it.
Okay, but in terms of the numbers, where the numbers come from, you're basically treating. So you're looking at a high load hour or a set of high, you're selecting a couple of high load hours, and you're looking at what was being imported during that set of high load hours, and that's your MIC. And then, yeah. But aren't you also, by fixing it at that, aren't you also assuming that there's no change in the profile of internal generation? In other words, aren't you also assuming that during the historical hours that you're looking at, the output from internal generators is fixed?
Yeah, so when we test it, actually we test based on deliverability studies. It's a tariff-approved method how to test deliverability. So all the internal resources coming from that area, along with the whatever is allocation on those intertypes coming from that area, are tested together to make sure they all fit. So all the generators that are connecting in that area that are, of course, can sell capacity, FCDS or PCDS, they are modeled as such, and we run deliverability studies per the approved methodology to make sure they all fit together. Now, when we do assign a MIC value, it is the absolute highest imports we've seen among the load that is above 90% of the peak load. So it has to be a decently, hot day, but it is the absolute highest imports we've ever seen. And then we take the calculation from there. It's your schedule plus all the unused ETCs and TORs. And then it gets tested for the policy, and if needed, it gets increased even beyond that to meet the policy goals.
Okay, but do you come up with a different number? I mean, in other words, in my mind, the fact that that's the highest level of imports that you've ever seen doesn't necessarily preclude a higher level of imports if load is higher or if internal generation is lower.
Yes, but
I mean, you've got the power balance constraint. I get that, but if the output from internal generators were lower, or if load were higher, presumably more imports could be received.
Again, let me try to explain that part. That again, we get back to a zero-sum game here. So we need to test all the internal generators that are allowed to sell RA because they can sell RA. I cannot assume I'm going to have less generators. I'm going to take deliverability away from internal resources to make room for MIC. I can't do that. So I have to maintain deliverability for all the internal generators, and I have to maintain the level of MIC coming from those intertypes. They're fairly steady across the year. Now, there are some small changes you can use. You look back in different years, but they're decently steady from one year to the next, such that there is very little impact interaction between the two. But what I'm trying to say is I cannot assume less internal generation because if I'm going to have anything, I'm going to have more internal generation in the future because new generators are getting into the system. Usually on these further away places, like closer to Palo Verde, closer to Meade, closer to the Coy, what retirements that we have are generally more closer to where the load is, and that doesn't influence as much deliverability. If you retire a unit in LA Basin, well, you can put another unit in LA Basin, and that's very easy, but you can't retire a unit in LA Basin and put a unit at Palo Verde. The unit at Palo Verde requires transmission to get all the way back to LA Basin. And there might not be available because other resources around Palo Verde already have that deliverability.
Okay. And you don't, so you assume, let me think how to phrase this. You're not looking at which internal generators actually have entered into RA contracts, right? In other words, you're assuming that a generator that has full deliverability status could enter into an RA contract. But do you look whether they actually have entered into RA contracts?
Yeah, that's correct. We are assuming that generators that are deemed deliverable will enter into a contract, and we have to protect that. Remember, deliverability studies are done around June, even before we tell July, even before we tell generator how much they can count for next year. I have to wait based on deliverability studies to tell them if they can count next year or not. At the same time, we also test mix. So everything gets tested together to make sure they work, but they get tested before the LSEs goes and do any procurement. The procurement only comes back at the end of October. All this work is done in June to assure that if we're allowing a generator to count for RA, if we're allowing MIC to count for RA, they all fit together.
Okay, let me ask another question. Let's say that the hour that you're looking at for the maximum imports is 8 p.m. When you test the simultaneous deliverability with internal generation, first of all, do you use the maximum possible output? In other words, do you use like the interconnection capability? And how would that work, say, for a solar resource? I mean, say if you had a solar resource that had a Pmax of 50 megawatts, but obviously its output at 8 p.m. is a whole lot less. When you when you do that simultaneous deliverability test, do you include that solar generator at 50 megawatts, or do you look at the output during the same hour?
Yeah, so this basically has to do with our deliverability methodology, which usually takes a 1 or 2 day full discussion. So basically, the generator gets tested mostly with their NQC values. However, there is different methodology for intermittent resources. There is exceedance values. So it's very lengthy and detailed. You would like to know the details on that. I suggest you study the deliverability methodology, and we can come back later if you have other questions, because it's very lengthy and extensive.
Okay. So I'm happy to follow up offline with questions, but that brings me to a process question. And Catalin, I don't know if you're the right person to answer this, or maybe one of the lawyers wants to weigh in. But I've been putting together questions about the calculation process and also actually some requests for information. And I'd like to know sort of what the process would be for submitting those questions to the CAISO, and in terms of, do you want to get those in comments? Do you want to get those in advance of comments? What would be your preference there?
I think it will be good to be included in the comments, just because everybody else can see them and our responses to them. I think that's fair. And if we can provide you or cannot provide you with something, we'll get you a legal opinion on that.
Okay. Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
There are no further questions in the queue.
Okay. Bonnie, did you have another question?
No, I don't think so. I think that.
Okay.
Apologies. I thought the question was over, and I did just mute her line. She's unmuted now.
Okay.
Apologies for cutting.
I think I'm done for now, unless there was something else you wanted to open up.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Bonnie. I'll move forward to the assignment process. So most of you know, an assignment process we have for import capability that is given to ISO LSCs. There may be a lot of language on the slide. You don't have to read it. Basically, the idea is that first, we put aside the ETCs and TOR rights owned by companies that are not part of the ISO, or load-sharing entities that are not part of the ISO. Those are set aside for basically their use. And then for internal to the ISO LSCs, the rest of the amount gets divided more or less on a load-share ratio, with priorities given to people who own today ETCs and TORs or PRA input commitments. Beyond that, it's purely load-share ratio. So this method that we have today, how to allocate it, is basically literally only used for RA, to show RA in system. That's the only purpose today. Next slide, please. So today we have the 13-step process, and we did have some requests in the past. I think San Diego, if I remember right, was one of the entities who entertained an auction mechanism. What if we don't have the 13-step process and we just open everything up for anybody to bid on this? Maybe it's more open. You will be able to get something above your load-share ratio if you're willing to pay for it, I guess. It could be to be a more transparent and efficient procurement. Only who needs it might want to get it. If the people don't really need it, they probably don't want to get it. So that gets to the efficiency issue here. We also had requests in the past for maybe a better trading platform. We were willing to entertain those. The challenges we have to overcome here is that, the cost implementing a new auction mechanism, it will be high once we, the first time we have to implement it, we have to build softwares and other stuff. How do we disperse the auction revenues could become complicated. We also had a relatively small interest in this issue. I think it was San Diego and probably one more request, maybe PowerX or somebody. I forgot exactly whom it was, but I know it was San Diego that had interest in an auction. Most other people didn't have too much of an interest in it. They preferred to keep whatever 13-step process we have today. Also, another thing that we have today, we have very low trading. We don't see much of a trading. We do catalog them all. They're not that many. I guess maybe they're not that many because we don't have a good platform. I guess if we would have maybe a much better trading platform, maybe we'll get more people to do trading. That's possible as well. And I think that's all I have about the allocation and auction. So I'll probably stop here and see if there are any insights or people want to provide any comments, if they would want to see this move to an auction or want to stay, or some other ideas about trading platforms you might have.
As a reminder, you can press #2 to enter the question queue. Do we have anyone in the queue?
There are no hands in their queue at this time.
Okay, I am seeing a question in the chat, so I'll read that out to you, Catalin. What if history is not a good projector of the future need for MIC? What if there is a fundamental change in the supply and demand for MIC, and how does the existing process respond in that case?
Yeah, so this is, I'm not sure exactly what we're talking about here. So, the usage has been actually fairly low in the past. So even though we gave out, these amounts, so even though 15,000 is the entire amount, over 3,000 of that is for outside the ISO LSE. So we still had over 10,000 some megawatts. We've never reached anywhere close to that. More often than not, it's only used 50 or 60%. So I guess if the demand changes, we should be seeing much higher usage. Before we would get into entertaining, how to fundamentally change the whole paradigm, we are not seeing very high usages. We've seen one time where it spiked, but other than that, we've seen rather lower usage. So I guess from the ISO perspective is we would like to see somewhat over higher usage, higher trading, before we would say that MIC is the binding problem. I would think, might be the binding problem is that we can't find anything to buy rather than having MIC. It might be easier to trade MIC since nobody else can find anything. You should not, you should have a very high value if you can't find anything behind it. So I'm not really sure where the problem is. I'm not seeing a fundamental change. The only thing that, yes, we are more pinched on resources. We have, reached a point where internal resources are very scarce, so we are counting more on imports. We are assuming people will be going and buying this stuff from the outside. We believe there is still room under MIC. There should not be a problem to accommodate that today, but we're willing to, that's why we're here. We're willing to entertain changes, and if you have a specific change you would like to propose, please put it in your comments and tell us exactly what change you are proposing.
Thanks, Catalin. And Mark, if you have any follow-up questions, you can enter the verbal queue by pressing #2. I'm seeing another question in the chat. If the MIC is only used at 50% to 60%, how does an entity use that available import?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about the usage in a little bit, so I'm gonna skip that question a little bit and get back to it later. Any other questions?
Not seeing any in the chat. Do we have any other on the phone?
All right, I'll move forward then.
Oh, I apologize, my line was muted. We do have a couple of questions in the queue if you'd like me to go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Caller, you are unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi there, thanks. Maybe this will get addressed in the use segment, but I had seen in reviewing the I guess change proposal that moving to specified resources only, whereas historically it seems like it has been allowable to use a mix of contracted but unspecified sources. Not sure if I'm understanding that correctly, but it seems relevant with respect to energy service supply from outside the ISO, especially as related to that, unused NIC. I mean, it occurs to me that the period there may be NIC reserved for contracted, out-of-state resources. Take Shepherd's Flat in Oregon, quite a large facility contracted into the ISO, presumably, applied to or has a big chunk of NIC applied to it, but maybe it's not generating near even close to capacity at those peak load periods. Is it possible to fill that in around the margins? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I didn't really understood what the question was here. I think it was more of a statement that that's probably true for any capacity market. So you'll have to remember that if the capacity we're procuring does not get transformed into energy, really the lights are not staying on. So I guess the short point is here that once you are shown as RA, you have to provide bids in the ISO market. If you have too many bids, then you might not win the bid, so you might not be putting your energy out, especially if you're expensive. But at least you're not putting your energy out because we have enough. If we don't have enough, we'll go all the way through the stack to the most expensive resource, and everybody should be having their energy flowing through that promise to be an RA resource. That's how it's supposed to be working, and that's how, probably that's why they were purchased to begin with. So I'm going to leave it at that because I did not really understand the question. It was more like a statement that some of the MIG might not be used. What we're not seeing is we're not seeing RA showing. So when I said we're not seeing them, it's not that we're not seeing energy. We're seeing energy because that's how the calculation is done. We're just not seeing enough RA showings coming through. It's more of an energy.
I don't know if I'm still off mute, but the question was, going forward, will unspecified resources be permitted to be counted as RA, assuming they show up?
Yes, we're having a different stakeholders for that. I'm going to let Milos respond to that. Milos, are you here?
Milos, maybe your line is muted.
Yeah, this is Milos. Yeah, so what we're proposing as part of our RA Enhancements initiative is really to move away from unspecified RA imports or non-resource specific imports towards resources that have similar characteristics but do have to identify the source, be delivered on high priority transmission, and also be supported by an attestation. So that's where we're looking to moving towards here in the near future, moving away from those unspecified imports, which they will still be able to provide energy but not qualify for RA.
And how does that marry with what seems like an excess in real time and underutilization of MIC in real time? Wouldn't it make sense, given the capacity shortfall, to be able to take advantage of those resources?
So this is Kat, and I'm not sure what we're talking. What exactly do you mean by real time? So let's just split this in two. RA is used in the year ahead and the month ahead time frame. So what I stated before is that we don't see too many showings. We don't see too many showings in the year ahead. We don't see too many showings in the month ahead. That's where the RA usage is calculated. I want you to flow into real time. There's no more the RA basically doesn't, it's just energy now. It's just those people who had RA were supposed to have, they must have bid in the ISO system, and those get taken along with everybody else who has bits in the ISO systems, and the most economic energy will flow through, but there is no more check on the RA in real time. So I'm not really sure what are you referring to when you say real time.
Yeah, sorry, that's a helpful clarification. Appreciate it.
Are there any other questions?
Yes, moving on to our next caller. You are now unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Bonnie Blair again. The usage information is very interesting and also kind of troubling, because I will tell you that several of the cities that I represent have been in the position of having an opportunity to buy import RA resources, have needed additional resources to meet their RA requirements, and haven't been able to enter into the RA contracts, or at least haven't been able to get RA credit for contracts for import resources because they can't find a MIC allocation. So that suggests to me that at least one, fairly intense focus of this initiative ought to be, if MIC isn't being used to support RA resources, why not? And what can be done to make sure that it is? I mean, there are two potential ways to be responsive to the problem that is facing my clients. One is increase the amount of MIC available, or two, overall. But if that isn't feasible, then, or even sensible, the other way is to make sure that the MIC that has been identified is actually used to support RA resources. So I throw that out. It may be there's a lot of unused MIC, but that's, the ISO should be aware that there are people who want to use it and can't get it.
Thank you, Bonnie. So this is a good precursor to my next slide. I'll come back to you, Bonnie, this way. I'm going to come back to the other person asking these questions, because I have the next few slides kind of deal with this issue. So I'll just go through the slides and return back to you. Okay?
Okay. Thanks.
So basically, here we have some suggestions from some stakeholders that basically, just like Bonnie said, if there is unused allocation, how can we recapture them and release them to other LSEs? So here is how usage usually gets done. Okay, some LSEs prefer to use their MIC in the year ahead time frame. Some do. Most actually don't. Most LSEs use it in the month ahead time frame. That's the majority of what we see coming through. And then some people actually use it as an insurance policy, and since it's kind of it's a property value, they can pretty much do whatever they want with it. So they use it. Some people use it for unit substitution to avoid rain penalties. So if a unit is going down, they're substituting that with a system resource that is coming from outside for a few days, a month, or maybe for the entire month. But they use it as usage substitution in order to avoid rain. So currently, the way we found out how people are using them, they're using it 3 different ways. Okay, so if we wish to somehow take it away, or either take it away, the question, the thing that we need to overcome is currently it's a property value. So we give it to somebody and they can actually sell it. They own it, they sell it, they can do whatever they want with it. What the proper compensation if we recapture it? Should that be a free recapture, or should they get some compensation? Also, it is very problematic today because we have rain. Now, once rain is scheduled to be decommissioned in the future once UCAP gets here. So, if we get into that paradigm, that we eliminate one of the major problems that we have today for people trying to hold it as an insurance policy. So another thing is that we have a complication is it's kind of a chicken and egg thing is we don't want to incentivize people to come in short. Why? Everybody needs to be compliant at T-minus 45. Every LSE should be compliant with T-minus 45. If people can use that allocation in the year ahead and the month ahead time frame, and everybody needs to comply by T-minus 45, then whatever is left, how can that get allocated to any other LSE that is short? Because basically the LSEs need to come in or willingly come in short just so they can see if there is any MIC allocation, not used, recapture those, give it to somebody else, make some more showings, sign some contract, make some showings, all within a span of a few days. I'm not sure how that is possible, either that or we need to change how the whole showings are made. Rather than having a T-minus 45, maybe imports need to be shown by T-minus 60, and then there'd be a few days to reallocate everything, or, first comes, first serve, I don't know, or compensation paid to the people we're taking it from. There needs to be some thinking behind how this can be accommodated if we are wishing to take allocations away because people didn't use them. Again, super problematic today because it's used for rain. Maybe a little less problematic in the future if we're only using it for a year ahead, a month ahead. Still, the problem that we're trying to avoid is that LSE is coming willingly short at T-minus some time in order to see if they can get allocation from somebody else that they could use. And we try to avoid having all the LSEs come in short just to see if there's any RA imports left. Isabella, to the next slide. So that was, kind of the last thing I had here, and, I'll open it up for this discussion about recapturing. We can try to see if there is a recapturing method, or we can try to see if maybe a better way to having a better trading platform. I'm thinking if RAIN gets eliminated, people will have more incentive because they have to show everything at T-minus 45. They'll be more inclined if they're not using it to sell it. I mean, I don't see what the point is for holding it. Today they're using it as an insurance policy, but if they don't need an insurance policy anymore since RAIN is gone, they should be willing to sell it, and there should be sellers and buyers. Currently, the trading platform that we have is not really a platform. It just tells you who sold to whom after they make a showing to us. So it's basically just an information purposes. There is no specific trading platform where people can actually input what they have and how much money they want for the trading, or what somebody else might be willing to pay for it. There's none of that. So it's not really a trading platform. Maybe we do need a better trading platform. Maybe we do need a recapturing method, but if we do need a recapturing method, we need to think very, very well about all the implications that drives, including cost and, making sure the LSEs are compliant by some date and not trying to come in uncompliant just to receive some more allocations. I'll open it up for more Q&A.
All right, we do have a couple of hands raised in the queue at this time. I'll go ahead and put the first caller through. Caller, you are unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hey, Catalin, it's Tony. Bonnie, I had raised my hand during the prior Q&A session. Bonnie had raised the question I was intending to tee up. But I do want to emphasize that I don't think we should go into this discussion with the presumption that because there's underutilized MIC, therefore it's not the barrier. I think it's very difficult to ascertain with this complex interaction between the RA and commercial rules and the MIC availability, whether there's a chicken or egg here. And given what we are getting as far as feedback from the POUs within your VA. It does seem to be a commercial barrier, so I think we should have an open mind about, what we're doing here. A corollary issue I'd like to better understand is something that's related to that point, and a point you raised earlier, Catalin, which is the availability of MIC on the various branch groups. So I'd like to maybe, as we proceed down this process, have a better understanding of where it's being utilized, where it's not being utilized, and then also really what the commercial availability is of transmission on the other sides of those branch groups for long-term transmission commitments, which you think would be associated with the RA resources. Anyway, I think there's other things perhaps that are outside the ISO system that need to be understood too.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. We think that that's part of maybe additional transparency. I guess we can always work on more transparency. Currently, there is no way to actually see the showings. The ISO needs to do a lot of digging through back data to figure out what the showings are, and it's not in a publicly nice form where you can actually go and easily figure it out. How much was one intertide used versus another versus the totals, and so we can definitely work on some upgrades and proposals for better transparency and pulling the data through. That being stated, that transparency needs to be translated somehow into, like you said, into a market mechanism to make sure that the people who do want additional MIC on certain intertides, at least they can find out whom has it and are not using it. Because right now I think it's a big box that you might not know who has it and who has used it and who didn't. Maybe that can become a little more transparent one way or another through some trading platforms or some way of making better use of it. If that's where the problem is today, it's a market, more of a market usage issue. If we are running into some branch groups that are just fully maximized and there is nothing available because literally everybody used all the way to the maximum, there's just nothing available. Now we go into an expansion proposal, how we expand certain expansions in branch groups, and maybe how the TPP takes it up and proposes even transmission upgrades that might be required in order to upgrade certain interties.
Catalin, a follow-up clarifying technical question. If there's a branch group out there that's related electrically to that is underutilized from a mix standpoint, but we know energy flows on it, to a branch group where you have both robust energy flows and MIC utilization, if you lower the MIC on the branch group that is underutilized, may it have an impact on expanding MIC on a more commercially utilized branch group?
That could be possible, but what I'm trying to say is that those two branch groups better be very close. So when we run deliverability studies, it's all about basically we have all the buses modeled and so there's literally no way to move deliverability from COI to Palo Verde, or from Mead. But if you're trying to say, okay, well, Mead, 230 kV, it's very liquid, and we've seen a lot of usage, both energy and RA, and it's always full on RA versus next branch group right next to it, it's Mead to Mead, and that one, we see energy, but we can almost never buy capacity on it. So can we move maybe some megawatts from Mead to Mead to Mead 230, since those points are so close to each other? If you do move some deliverability from one to the other, will have very little impact. Can I say it will always work? No, I can't say that, and we actually test through deliverability studies. But theoretically, it will have a good chance of working. It will have almost no chance of working if you're trying to move deliverability from Mead to COI. So there is points that are very close to each other. There is a chance we can move stuff around, but if they're further away, the further away you go, the worse you're going to end up.
You answered my question precisely. Thank you.
All right, should we move on to the next caller?
Yes, go ahead.
Caller, you are unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hey, hi, Catalan. This is Chris Devon from Customized Energy Solutions. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
All right. Thanks for the discussion. I just had a couple of reactions to, I think, some of the stuff that Bonnie and Tony were talking about. I guess the first thing I thought of was that the external transmission availability is really a big issue here. And I'm wondering if there's some way that the CAISO could consider, working with the CPUC, and maybe this is getting a little bit ahead of ourselves and maybe more towards like that wheeling priority issue that you're going to talk about, so we can hold off on discussing it. But just an idea I had was thinking about the fact that, the CAISO and CPUC doesn't really have like the counterfactual of the information when a MIC, potential import would have been utilized, but isn't actually, able to because there's not enough MIC. And so it doesn't show up anywhere. If there was some way that the PUC could recognize that and the CAISO could note that and then incorporate that into their planning processes, I think that would be more appropriate, or somehow be able to reflect this need for transmission expansion and somehow incorporate that. But I guess a lot of this has to do with some of the fact that there's this whole interregional transmission planning process that needs to be, potentially looking at transmission outside of the CAISO to support internal import RA needs and load needs and that sort of thing. And I guess there's some disconnect between all these processes, the TPP and IRP, and the fact that there's really not that information about what MIC potential usage, what wasn't used, to support an import contract and that sort of thing for RA purposes. So just something to think about. I know that I don't have a concrete proposal, but I'm just pointing out that I think you can't just simply increase the MIC just because folks want to add additional, import RA, to meet their needs. If there's not really enough import available in those external ties where everybody wants to bring it in on. Otherwise, it's really not commercially feasible to bring it in on some of those less used interties that are maybe more expensive to get that transmission on or something like that. So just some reactions to think about there. Maybe it's more appropriate to talk about that later. So you don't have to respond if you don't have thoughts on it, but just some ideas to think about. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I think what I'm taking from this is the point you're bringing, it goes more into transparency, market, and maybe liquidity. How do we adjust certain branch groups for liquidity? And, we can get that information. Maybe, like you said, maybe a good point is some of the contracts at the PUC, some of the contracts, like Tony was explaining, that they might have found some contracts someplace, but there was no MIC available. That would be another point where you can, check some boxes that, okay, maybe we need more from this area rather than from the other area. And that's what I'm taking from that. And we can work in the future steps, maybe how to come up with what that is.
Yeah.
We have any more questions?
I think that's a good description. I guess some way that for potentially, rather than just looking at what actual amounts of MIC have been utilized, how much has been allocated, and making that transparent, I'm all for that. I think that's helpful and useful for just commercial purposes and transparency. But then also, in addition to that, maybe some voluntary process where different entities, LSEs that tried to use MIC and were blocked somehow because they needed additional MIC capability on a certain intertie point could voluntarily say, hey, I had a 100 megawatt deal that I could have done on this intertie point, and show that to folks and let the PUC know and let the CAISO know, so that they know that maybe they need to think about incorporating those things into, future IRP planning portfolios that then can actually be more readily utilized for the CAISO TPP policy projects or other, forward-looking MIC process or something like that. Because I think there's this barrier here where it seems like there's a disconnect between the transmission planning process and the MIC and RA process in some way, and that's what I'm trying to get at. So, but I'll leave it at that. That's kind of my thoughts on this issue here, and I appreciate the chance for the input. Thank you.
How many more questions do we have in the queue?
We have one more question in the queue. Should I go ahead and put them through?
Sure, go ahead.
Caller, you are unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, it's Ellen Wolf from Mazzaro Consulting again. I had two questions. One's more information gathering, and the other one's a little bit more maybe conceptual. But I didn't understand, if you said it, I'm sorry, I missed it, why LSCs aren't tending to use their MIC in the year ahead showings. Could you say a little bit more about that, or repeat it if you did say, please?
Yeah, so I don't know why. I'm just stating the fact that some LSCs are using their MIC in the year ahead time frame. Not all of them. The majority are actually using it in the month ahead showings. You know, they can use it in the year ahead. They can, again, in the year ahead time frame, we're not making showings with 100%, right? It's only 90% of 115%. So there is some additional that needs to be made in the month ahead. And some people prefer showing it in the year ahead time frame. Some people prefer showing those imports in the month ahead time frame. Whatever it is. I think I've seen more in the month ahead than I've seen in the year ahead. But some LSCs are just holding it back all the way through the month in order to avoid rain penalties. If a resource is going out and you need a replacement for it in order to avoid rain, if you do have MIC, you can bring an import to replace that unit and not have rain penalty. So some people are using it for that. That would go away once we move to use that. Yeah.
Sure, I got that part. Do you have a gut feeling as to whether the year ahead showings tend to be more satisfied with internal resources and the month ahead showings more so with imported resources?
Yeah, it literally depends from LSC to LSC. As I said before, some LSCs prefer making showings with imports in the year ahead. Some of the LSCs prefer making more showings with internal resources and then bring more imports in the month ahead. It's not an ISO preference. I'm just stating what I've seen.
Sure. Okay. And then my other more exploratory question is, it just doesn't make a lot of sense to me that there isn't a good place for an auction here. You know, I agree that without some way to receive some value back for that optionality on holding the import capability, you know, as an option, it would be sort of hard for an LSC to let it go. I wonder if maybe your sense of lack of support for the auction has just been more about the ISO's statements about what's been feasible to do in the short run versus the long run, because my recollection was there was a lot of support early on for the auction. It just has been obviously a much more complicated mechanism to implement, but with some sort of auction or auction revenue rights or something like that where an LSC could decide how much it's worth for them, you know, how much they're really paying for that option in terms of avoided revenues from making that available to somebody else. It just seems like it would be a good fit here. So I encourage you to not just discount that as a possibility.
Yeah, but again, I'm not discounting it as a possibility. I was just stating a fact that, you know, the last year when we talked about it, we only had maybe like 2 interested parties in it. And I'm not saying that there may be more interested parties today. I'm just trying to have a feel for the stakeholders, you know. And if you prefer that, please put it in your comments, and then we'll take that under consideration.
Okay. Yeah, I think maybe we've just been not very optimistic, but also, you know, it isn't there's sort of panacea quality to it. There is a bit of a bias, I think, still, like even in the CRR processes for some LSCs to not have a good way to value what those rights are worth to them. So it's a tricky problem. Thank you.
I do see one other question in the chat. How do you see a possible trading platform working? It is definitely needed for those trying to buy MIC in the future. A trading platform would provide insight into the liquidity at each intertie. What are your thoughts? I
think a trading platform would be, you know, would be good. I will be willing to listen to the actual LSEs, how to design it the best so they can actually use it. If we design it, we might as well use it. So I would like their input, but I'm thinking that, owners of each right on each intertype definitely to be there. If they're using it, they should block it ahead so they know people that they're not willing to sell that. People who are willing to sell, they should, state as such. Maybe they can even put the price in there. And I don't know exactly how to design it, but I do think it will probably be an improvement. But I'm waiting from most of the people who are using it to tell me if they think it's going to be, or people who are using it and, wishing to buy it and sell it, if it's useful to them. It's not useful if people are not using it, right? So you don't want to build a platform. It's going to take some time. We're going to need to build software. It's probably going to be expensive, but this is not the point. The point is everybody's going to be using it and they'll be happy with the product they get. And it's becoming a tradable product, a much better tradable product. I think everybody would be okay with it. We just need to understand, how much willingness from the people who have the MIG are to be using one.
Thanks, Caroline. Do we have any other questions before we move on?
We have no further questions in the queue at this time.
Okay.
Okay.
I think I'll hand it over to Milos. Yes, go ahead.
All right. Thanks, Isabella, and good afternoon, everybody. Just briefly going to cover that we only have one slide on this particular topic, but I'll cover a bit of the background and then the scope, and we'll open it up for questions. So this component of this larger MIC Enhancements initiative is going to explore the development of a process for the reservation of import capability and transmission across the ISO system for wheel-through transactions. And it's also going to look, as a result, it's going to review the market scheduling priorities for wheel-through transactions. I think the idea is that there will be a distinction between the priority for wheel-through transactions that have reserved the import capability and transmission ahead of time compared to those that have not reserved it in advance. This is also an effort that's come out of the current Summer 2021 Readiness Initiative, which is currently looking at wheeling and export priorities for Summer 2021 and the near term. This particular effort, like Catalin noted at the beginning, is looking at it from a longer-term basis. We noted in the Summer 2021 Readiness paper that, we couldn't necessarily for this summer develop a process that provides for the reservation of import capability and transmission for wheel-through transactions. So that's why we recommended that we undertake that as part of a longer-term initiative, and the Summer 2021 Readiness Initiative will look at the near-term priorities for wheel-throughs and export transactions. Consequently, I'll just note that tomorrow is when I think we expect the publication of the final proposal for that Summer 2021 Readiness, which will provide further, I think, enhancements to the proposal on export and wheeling priorities that would be in place for summer of 2021, and until we can develop a process under this longer-term framework. So let's talk a little bit just about the background and context to the extent you haven't necessarily been following the Summer 2021 Readiness Initiative. But under the current framework, wheel-through transactions can be self-scheduled, and as a result of the market scheduling priority that wheel-through transactions have, self-scheduled wheels can be awarded ahead of RA imports that are economically offered into the market. And so this can lead to, and especially in tight system conditions and energy emergencies, but this can lead to crowding out of RA resources, which, like I said, is particularly critical in an emergency situation in favor of wheel-through transactions. While RA imports are supported by import capability today, which is allocated, like Catalin noted, in an annual process, wheel-through transactions currently do not acquire or reserve that import capability in advance to support their transactions, so they could come in essentially the hour ahead, the day ahead, and self-schedule into the market, and they would be awarded over a RA import that's been offered economically into the market. Additionally, I'll note that RA imports, aside from, again, having that secured import capability through the annual process to support their participation in the market. RA imports also are secured and are supported by long-term or month-ahead contracts because LSEs have to make showings in the annual and the monthly time frames that essentially they have RA imports that are supported by a contract. And in the future, what we're proposing as well, if you're following our RA Enhancements initiative, is that RA imports will have to be supported also by high-priority transmission to be delivered to the CAISO system. So, on the other hand, you have wheel-through transactions that don't necessarily have those same qualities and may be supported by low-priority transmission. I apologize. I'm working here with a baby, but I think we'll get through this. Okay. So wheel-through transactions, like I said, may not have some of those same qualities that are RA imports, which, again, have import capability, are secured under contracts either on a long-term basis or a monthly basis to support their showings to the CAISO. And in the future, again, RA imports are going to be supported by high-priority transmission to be delivered to the CAISO. So this component is really going to focus, like I said before, on identifying a process where those wheel-through transactions are going to be able to reserve import capability and transmission across our system if they choose to do so. And we'll review the scheduling priority in the market as well for those wheel-through transactions that have chosen to reserve that transmission and the import capability compared to those that have not. That will be part of the scope of this effort as well. So let me just briefly touch on then some of the scope items within this particular initiative. And I'll note at the end, but we certainly recommend that if you have any additional elements that you think should be considered or any other principles, but by all means, please include those in your comments. But we're going to look to develop that process for reserving import capability and transmission that hasn't been allocated to RA imports. We're also going to look to develop a simultaneous feasibility test that's going to equitably allow access to transmission on our system, including for wheel-through transactions. And then we're also going to review the scheduling priorities for these wheel-through transactions compared to load, compared to exports. And again, there may be different flavors of wheel-through transactions depending upon whether those reserve import capability and transmission ahead of time or not. So we certainly, this is just a scope identification slide. We're currently working internally, thinking through the different options and the different frameworks, but to the extent that you have any suggestions or concepts or principles that you think we should be abiding by and considering throughout this process, would certainly appreciate you including those into your comments. I'll open it up for questions now.
As a reminder, you can enter the question queue by pressing #2 on your telephone keypad.
We have one question in the queue at this time. I'll go ahead and put them through. Caller, you are unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, Milos. This is Chris Devin from Customized Energy Solutions again. Thanks for this part of the presentation. And I think you answered part of my questions when you guys mentioned the fact that there might be a need for different levels of wheel-through prioritization or something along those lines. So I was just curious about a couple of aspects of this part of the initiative. One, if you guys are contemplating that there would be some other type of transmission service that would be developed under this, or if it's just rather basically some type of a forward reservation and payment of TAC or WAC charges or something like that on like a monthly or annual basis, or if you're thinking of some other type of thing, more like point-to-point transmission service or something like that. So that's one question. And then my second question is, because of this concept of having maybe a test for like the simultaneous feasibility, it does seem to me like that would significantly limit the amount of wheeling that would be allowed that would be simultaneously feasible potentially. And I guess in that sense, it does seem to make a lot of sense to me that you would want to have maybe a different level of prioritization for different wheeling transaction priority that would have, one that would be more forward and have higher priority under this kind of simultaneous feasibility test process, and ensuring deliverability and all that is protected for the imports and such. And then another one that allows for wheeling that would have, lower priority and, ability to kind of use economic imports or economic transactions for wheeling and that sort of thing, and still be able to utilize that extra transmissions, maybe not always simultaneously feasible for delivery purposes. So those are a couple things that I was thinking of on this item.
Yeah, no, thanks, Chris. Good questions. Yeah, so on the first one, at least at this stage, we're not necessarily looking at creating a different product, but I think it's the concept, transmission product, but it's the concept that you alluded to, which is prepayment of transmission in advance for the duration that they're looking to reserve. So we're not necessarily looking at creating a point-to-point or some other type of product, at least at this stage. But to the extent, stakeholders have any comments on that aspect, we certainly appreciate those. And then on your second question, yeah, you're right. I think the idea is that we would have those two types of wheeling products or wheeling priorities, which is the high priority and low priority, for lack of a better term, at this stage. But the high priority would be the one that's reserved that import capability in the transmission ahead of time, and the low priority is the one that hasn't. It's kind of status quo today. Submits it the day before, the hour before, and sees how the market awards it. But we can certainly think through what happens if it doesn't pass the simultaneous feasibility test. Does that also impact what impact that has on the priority of that particular import or wheel through transaction? But at least at this stage, we are thinking of those two high and low priority wheel throughs, and we're working through what those qualities will be for each one of them. I think some of this may also be informed by what we propose in the near term, which I think, like I said, the paper will be issued tomorrow. I think that's a starting point. We may retain some of those qualities based on what will ultimately end up here in the near term, but the idea is to create those two flavors of high and low priority wheel throughs, with the high one having the ability to reserve the transmission ahead of time and the import capability.
All right. Thank you very much for that, Milos. I appreciate the response and a little bit more of the expansion on your thinking about that prioritization piece and the different wheeling options potentially. So that really helps. Have a good one. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
Yes, we have two more in the queue. I'll go ahead with the next caller. You are now unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hey, Milos. Steve Greenleaf, Brookfield. Couple questions. I just want to make sure I fully understand kind of the scope of this effort. Number one, I guess, a clarification. I just want to make sure, nothing has changed over the last year or so that I missed. But first of all, with respect to MIC allocations, MIC in general, but as they apply to RA imports, obviously that's it's an RA qualifying capacity accounting convention, effectively. It's not an actual transmission reservation. But in this instance, with respect to the wheel throughs, you actually are talking about an actual transmission reservation. Is that right?
Yeah, the transmission, I think it would be, at least as we're looking at it, kind of a separate component of it, and similar to the allocation of import capability. They would need essentially both import capability and transmission across our system to be able to wheel through and have that higher priority wheel through transaction.
Yeah, and maybe I'm just not understanding it fully, but MIC is not a transmission reservation. It doesn't entitle you to, that capacity is not set aside. It's basically, right? I mean, and Kat will weigh in here, but, the whole MIC construct is really to qualify RA imports to count as RA. It doesn't set aside transmission capacity. So I'm just grappling with the concepts of, because you're talking about you do the import RA allocation, the MIC allocation, and then you'll see what's left over and make that available to wheel-through schedules. But it's not exactly an apples-to-apples comparison, unless I'm misunderstanding something here. So, and certainly I support the effort to look at, forward procurement, enable entities to forward procure and reserve transmission for wheel-through schedules. I think that is an important effort. But to me, it's just a little different. So I was just, for example, obviously the MIC right now is an annual process. You allocate that import RA, import capability, and that is good for a year. So when you're talking about a wheel-through reservation, I'm assuming that would necessarily have to be limited to a year because you're going to be redoing the MIC. Anyway, I hope that makes sense. I'm just trying to understand the scope of this effort and how it compares.
Yeah, and along those lines, we're still working through what those frameworks will look like and in what time frames can wheel-throughs ultimately, reserve or request import capability and transmission across the system. Whether that's, like you said, at the same time that the MIC is being allocated or, potentially even on a monthly time frame as well, to the extent there's unused MIC after the showing. So we're still working through the different frameworks and, what the different options are. But the idea is to allow them to have reserve that import capability as an indication of essentially having space on a particular branch group to import into our system. And then the transmission is to wheel through across our system. But Catalin, feel free to jump in if you want to add anything else to that.
Yeah, I think you have it right.
Okay, thanks for the response, and I'll give it some further thought. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, send me a note if you want. After I can send you an email and explain this a bit more if that helps the distinction between import capability and transmission, and we'll highlight this as well in the paper.
Okay.
In the next bit.
Thank you.
All right, shall we move on to the next caller?
Yeah, go ahead.
Caller, you are now unmuted. Please go ahead.
This is Partha Malvadkar with PG&E. Thanks, Neil, for the discussion. Most of my questions you just answered, so I'll just focus on the last one. I was just wondering, just curious if you've given any thought to what the study process would look like for wheeling transactions, and would this be any different from how you would study and analyze MIC for imports? Like particularly, for example, if let's just say that there's a wheel coming in over Cobb that was looking to export in the Southwest, would that be the same process that would look for an import at Cobb, or are you thinking about doing something different in that respect?
Yeah, we're still in the midst of kind of thinking through the frameworks and what, if any, studies would be needed to support those allocations for wheels. I think that the easiest frameworks that we've been thinking through are essentially, not necessarily any additional studies, but to the extent that that we allocate import capability in the annual time frame and there's something left over that hasn't been allocated, no additional study process, but wheel-through transactions can request that to reserve that unallocated import capability at a particular branch group, or potentially they have the ability to procure it from other parties who have it at a particular branch group and reserve it that way. But we're still thinking through some of those frameworks and whether there's a different framework that would require any kind of separate study for wheel-through transactions. If you have any comments on that or you see it valuable, if there be a separate study process that supports some of those wheel-through transactions and the allocation of import capability to them, certainly note that. But we're still working through the different frameworks that are possible, and at least at this point, we're gravitating towards the ones that are a little bit easier, which don't necessarily change the study processes.
No, that seems fair. Thanks, Milos. And I was glad to hear. It sounds like as well you're looking at different timelines. For example, if it's a yearly type of reservation or a monthly type of reservation. And one thing I'd be curious if you've done any comparisons to what other RTO markets do in this respect.
Yeah, we're in the midst of doing some of that benchmarking, both with ISOs and other RTOs, as well as the frameworks that the other transmission providers across the West have. And I'm anticipating that once we conclude that, we'll make sure to include it into the next iteration of the paper, what we've found. But we're in the midst of conducting that benchmarking right now.
That sounds great. Yeah, thanks, Milos. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
How many other questions do we have in the queue?
We have one other in the queue at this time.
Okay, go ahead.
Caller, you are unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, it's Ellen Wolf from Reserve Consulting again. I have to admit that I don't understand this. I guess I thought I did, but I don't. Why is it that a wheel-through transaction needs an MIC allocation?
Yeah, so this is Milos and Catalin. Jump in and if you feel the need to, but import capability essentially grants you the ability to access our system of different branch groups. It essentially sets aside capability, sufficient capability to support transactions that need to come into our system. And so the thought here is to provide wheel-through transactions, the ability to reserve transmission and import capability ahead of time to be able to, on a comparable basis as RA imports, access our system. And then that leads to the differentiation and scheduling priorities between high priority wheels and low priority wheels that may not have reserved that ahead of time.
But so for what purpose would that be? I guess maybe I'm sort of tagging on to Steve's question. A wheel-through transaction is not fulfilling an RA need in the CAISO, is it? Seems like it's the apples and orange paradigm you're kind of mixing or considering mixing.
Yeah, but I think the concern is that allowing wheel-through transactions, it may crowd out RA imports today, for example. You could have a wheel-through transaction that self-schedules that crowds out an RA import that has reserved that import capability and it has that set aside, and that import capability essentially, by not being awarded to that RA import, it's utilized to support the wheel transaction. So
are you,
the idea
is it because you're, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Is it because you're considering forward reservations for wheel-throughs?
Right.
Or what?
Yeah, so wheel-throughs will have the process where wheel-throughs will really have the ability to reserve the import capability and transmission ahead of time to support those wheels across our system, compared to those that do not reserve it ahead of time and just kind of the status quo today are offered or self-scheduled and the day ahead of real time.
I see. So can LSEs serving load in the CAISO also reserve the import capability ahead of time and solve their, for example, MIC problem and
Yeah, so those would be, that's essentially what's done today, where LSEs are allocated that import capability ahead of time, and then they utilize that to support their RA imports with the parties that they've contracted with. So today the LSEs are allocated to the process that Catalin highlighted, are allocated MIC on a long-term basis in the year ahead time frame.
Yes.
So it's kind of a raising. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, just to add to that, so today MIC is only an RA product, not a transmission product. So, what we're trying to kind of work our way through how everything flows from the year ahead to real time and what are the priorities. When you reach real time, who has a higher priority? So once you decide what those priorities are, you have to go all the way back maybe to the month ahead and to the year ahead to have them on comparable basis. Because today our LSEs are paying for transmission. The wheels are not paying for transmission, where on a yearly basis they only pay when for a day at a time or something like that. But yet they have higher priority. So the load gets curtailed before that. So if you think all the way through, then they would need to have their own reservation system. And, you know, the only way to do that is probably to make them pay for some kind of a transmission, because they don't have RA in the ISO. Now, if you do look at step 6 of the import allocation process, there's close to 5,000 megawatts that is actually set aside for non-ISO LSEs, so basically, or entities not on the ISO. We know, for example, that SMUD and LA and some others have, you know, already have rights through the ISO. In the MIC allocation process, those are set aside before we divide the remaining pie to the ISO LSEs. So we already have some reservation for them. It's just not used for anything today. So I think what they're trying to do is they're trying to link this concept that we are already having some reservations for some of them, maybe not for everybody who wants it, but for some people we already have one way of reservation, except we don't get any payments for transmission. Somehow they're trying to link all of this together and you know, have a product that is tested in the year ahead, month ahead time frames with higher reservation priority than somebody that just comes in the day ahead priority. So I think that's how the construct are trying to think about, but we're not 100% there. We're just having an idea where kind of wants to go. So if you have any ideas, you can tell us your ideas about that.
Okay, and I had one other narrow question. For the export part of that, would you create additional MIC then, if you can count on the wheel through?
Yeah, so in MIC, it is already accounted for that. So because we're taking all of the net schedules, we already account for stuff coming through in one intertie and going out in another one. The methodology uses the net numbers.
Oh, darn. Okay. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Are there any other questions?
We have one more question in the queue. I'll go ahead and put them through. Caller, you are unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hey, Miloš and Catalin, this is Steve Greenlake with Brookfield again. I think Ellen's question made me think I'm not crazy. Well, maybe I am, but I think in the next iteration, I think it's going to be really important that you guys distinguish, well, number one, be careful with the use of terms, because the MIC in no way is a transmission reservation. I mean, the way I've always thought about it and the way I thought the CAISO always characterized it, it's an RA counting dimension. It just, in the year ahead and the month ahead, it's just, yes, you know, there's a high expectation this import RA is going to be deliverable to the CAISO, and this entity, this LSE, will be able to count on that in satisfying its RA requirement. But when it comes to actual real-time utilization of the transmission system, it in no way has a transmission reservation. It has to compete like anybody else on that intertie. So, and I think the concept in the context of the wheeling transactions, in how that came up in the summer 2021 market enhancements initiative, was real-time scheduling priorities. But in the context of I think what you're talking about here, it actually is truly a reservation of the system. So it's not the same thing as an allocation of MIC. At least I'm still not there
Right.
yet. So I really don't think it is kind of an apples to apples. So how you're rolling from a year ahead monthly RA showing NIC process and, and confirmation, I guess, into kind of a real-time transmission utilization reservation priority, it's a critical difference. So this is a really complicated issue because, I understand the premise is all the load in California is paid for the transmission system. So I don't know if you're thinking of that in terms of kind of a macro transmission reservation. But when it comes to real time and actually scheduling coordinators are scheduling those import RA resources, be it on the import RA supply side, SE side, or the LSE scheduling it, there's no guarantee that's flowing. I mean, obviously, there's self-scheduling and everything else associated with it. So anyway, long-winded way of saying, just as you kind of move this forward, I guess I urge you, at least for my sake, to just be very clear on when you're talking import capability, don't necessarily equate that with a transmission reservation. So I guess that's
a fair point.
Request.
Yeah, fair point, Stephen. And what we're ultimately trying to do here is providing open access to our system and essentially this is a product that wheel-through transactions would have to, procure to have that higher reservation priority, which is a product that consists of, import capability plus essentially transmission across our system. But that's how we're essentially thinking of it is this is a new product that could put wheel-throughs on par with RA imports, trying to match up some of those requirements that wheel-through must have this new product in place and pay for it in advance to be able to have that higher reservation priority.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I think it's complicated enough where you're gonna be forced in a way to kind of meld terms which may be commonly referred or used in an OAT framework versus the CAISO tariff, and then how that all kind of spills into real-time scheduling priorities, curtailment priorities, et cetera. So anyway, I think you understand what I'm saying. So I'll leave it at that. Yeah. But as you guys move forward, just be careful on the choice of words, just so if no one else, I can understand it.
Sounds good. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
We have no further questions in the queue at this time.
Okay. Since we are right at 3 o'clock, there's one question in the chat, so I'll read that out loud and then we'll move on to next steps. So is high priority transmission long-term firm to CAISO interface of a duration at least equal to the associated showing, either monthly or annual?
Can you read that again? Is high priority transmission to the CAISO system?
Yes, long-term firm to CAISO interface of a duration at least equal to the associated showing, either monthly or annual.
And what's the question? Whether that's a requirement or?
It's just defining the term, or more simply, how are you defining high priority transmission?
Yeah, what we're referring to is high priority wheel-through transactions. I was referring to high priority transmission in the context of what we are planning to require or we're proposing to require for RA imports, which is, in that case, what we're proposing for RA imports has to be firm transmission to the last leg, on the last leg of the intertie to the CAISO system, and upstream of that, it can be firm, conditional firm, or monthly non-firm. That's the proposal for RA import high priority transmission currently.
Okay, thanks.
But for wheel-through transactions, we're not necessarily defining anything at this stage here, requiring a long-term firm transmission. At the beginning, I was trying to make the comparison that we're imposing higher requirements, and we're planning to increase those requirements on RA imports in the future compared to, wheel-through transactions today that can really wheel across our system, just being requested in a day ahead or hour ahead and without any kind of particular quality requirements. It can be delivered on low priority or non-firm transmission, and we still give it that high priority compared to RA imports.
Thanks, Miloš. Okay, so now we'll move on to next steps, including our proposed initiative schedule. So we did post the issue paper on March 11th, and we'll be accepting comments on that paper until April 1st. And then we are looking at the May timeframe for posting the straw proposal, so that's targeted for early May. And then we will post a revised straw proposal probably at the end of June, and then a draft final proposal at the beginning of September with a targeted Board of Governors meeting date of November. And then after the Board of Governors approval, we'll do the FERC filing. So that is the proposed schedule. And then, as I mentioned, comments are due by end of day April 1st. The comments template is available out on the initiative webpage, so feel free to use that to submit your comments anytime between now and April 1st. So are there any other questions before we conclude?
There are no questions in the queue at this time.
Okay. Then that concludes today's stakeholder call. Thank you for your participation, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Alrighty, that concludes today's conference. You may now disconnect. Thank you for using AT&T Event Conferencing Enhanced.